On a single day in 88 BC, across dozens of cities throughout Asia Minor, 80,000 people were murdered. Not soldiers, not combatants, civilians, men, women, and children. Merchants and moneylenders, farmers and craftsmen. Entire families dragged from their homes, hunted through the streets, cut down in temples where they had fled for sanctuary. The blood ran so thick in some cities that the gutters couldn't drain it fast enough. They were Romans and Italian citizens and allies of the greatest power in the Mediterranean world, and they were slaughtered like animals in a coordinated massacre that stretched from the Aegean coast to the mountains of Cappadocia. The man who ordered this atrocity wasn't a barbarian warlord or a religious fanatic. He was a king educated, sophisticated, fluent in 22 languages. He was a patron of the arts, a student of Greek philosophy, a collector of precious gems. He styled himself as a liberator come to free the Greek cities of Asia from Roman oppression. His name was Mithridates VI of Pontus. History would remember him as Mithridates the Great, and the massacre known to history as the Asian Vespers was just the beginning. For the next quarter century, Mithridates would wage war against Rome with a ferocity and persistence that no enemy had matched since Hannibal. He would fight 3 separate wars, face down the greatest Roman generals of the age, and survive defeats that would have destroyed any other king. He would become so paranoid about assassination that he spent years building up immunity to poison, consuming small doses daily until his body could withstand doses that would kill an ordinary man. And in the end, when his own son betrayed him and his kingdom crumbled around him, he would discover that his famous immunity to poison had one terrible drawback. When he finally wanted to die, he couldn't. This is the story of the Poison King, the man who killed 80,000 Romans in a single day and spent the rest of his life paying for it. To understand how one man could order such a massacre and why so many people were willing to carry it out, you need to understand what Rome had become by the late 2nd century BC. The Roman Republic had transformed from a regional Italian power into the dominant force in the Mediterranean world. In the span of just a few generations, Rome had destroyed Carthage, conquered Greece, absorbed large portions of Spain and North Africa, and established itself as the arbiter of kings throughout the eastern Mediterranean. But Roman expansion brought Roman exploitation. The provinces that fell under Roman control were treated as resources to be extracted, not territories to be governed. Roman governors arrived with one goal: to enrich themselves as quickly as possible before their term ended. They taxed the provincials mercilessly. They accepted bribes to render favorable judgments. They looked the other way while Roman businessmen, the publicani, or tax farmers, squeezed every last coin from the population. The Greek cities of Asia Minor had once been proud and independent. They had been centers of culture, commerce, and learning for centuries. Now they were Roman subjects, forced to pay tribute to a distant power that cared nothing for their welfare. And everywhere the Romans went, they brought with them a class of Italian businessmen, merchants, and moneylenders who settled in the provinces to profit from Roman rule. These Italians were deeply unpopular. They charged usurious interest rates. They foreclosed on property when loans couldn't be repaid. They served as the visible face of Roman economic exploitation. By 88 BC, decades of accumulated resentment had created a powder keg. All it needed was a spark. Mithridates was that spark. Mithridates VI was born around 130 for BC in the Kingdom of Pontus, a territory on the southern coast of the Black Sea in what is now northern Turkey. Pontus was a Hellenistic kingdom ruled by a dynasty of Persian descent, but culturally Greek, that had maintained its independence by carefully navigating between the great powers. His childhood was a nightmare. When Mithridates was about 11 years old, his father Mithridates V was assassinated at a banquet, poisoned by unknown conspirators. The kingdom passed nominally to the young prince, but real power was held by his mother, Laodice, who served as regent. Laodice had no intention of giving up power when her son came of age. Ancient sources suggest that she actively tried to kill him multiple times, either to retain her position or to advance the interests of her younger son, whom she apparently preferred. Mithridates survived by fleeing the palace. According to legend, he spent 7 years living in the wilderness, hiding from his mother's assassins, hunting for food, sleeping in caves and forests. It's unclear how much of this story is literally true, but the psychological impact is undeniable. Mithridates grew up trusting no one, expecting betrayal at every turn, and developing a fierce determination to survive at any cost. During these years of exile, he also developed his famous obsession with poison. Understanding that assassination was the constant companion of ancient kings, Mithridates determined to make himself immune. He experimented with small doses of various toxins, gradually increasing the amounts over time. He studied antidotes obsessively, working with court physicians to develop compounds that could neutralize common poisons. According to ancient sources, he eventually created a universal antidote called the Mithridates, a complex mixture of dozens of ingredients that was supposed to protect against all known poisons. The formula was so famous that versions of it were still being used in European medicine nearly 2,000 years later. Whether the Mithridates actually worked is debatable. What's certain is that Mithridates became genuinely resistant to at least some poisons, a fact that would have ironic consequences at the end of his life. Around 116 BC, when he was approximately 18 years old, Mithridates returned from exile and seized power. He had his mother arrested and imprisoned, where she eventually died, probably murdered on his orders. His younger brother was also eliminated. Anyone associated with his mother's regime was purged. The boy who had fled for his life was now king, and he was absolutely ruthless. Mithridates was not content to rule the small kingdom his father had left him. From the beginning, he pursued an aggressive policy of expansion, using a combination of military force, diplomatic marriage, and opportunistic land grabs to extend Pontic power. He annexed Colchis, on the eastern shore of the Black Sea, the legendary land of the Golden Fleece. He established dominance over the Greek cities of the Crimean Peninsula. He expanded eastward into Lesser Armenia and gained influence over the Armenian kingdom through a marriage alliance with its king Tigranes the Great. By the early 1st century BC, Mithridates controlled a vast territory stretching around the Black Sea. He commanded substantial military forces, including a powerful fleet and a large army. He had access to the gold mines of Colchis and the grain production of Crimea. He was, without question, the most powerful king in Asia Minor, but all of his expansion was pushing him toward a collision with Rome. The Romans had established a province in Asia Minor, the province of Asia, formed from the former kingdom of Pergamon, and they claimed influence over the smaller kingdoms and cities of the region. Mithridates' growing power threatened to upset the balance. Roman officials in the east watched him with increasing alarm. The flashpoint came in the mid-90s BC, when Mithridates began meddling in the kingdoms of Bithynia and Cappadocia, territories that Rome considered within its sphere of influence. When local kings appealed to Rome for help against Pontic aggression, the Senate sent commissioners to restore the status quo. Mithridates backed down temporarily, but he was studying his enemy, learning their methods, probing their weaknesses. And when he saw convinced him that Rome was not as invincible as it appeared. The Rome that Mithridates observed in the 90s BC was a republic tearing itself apart. The political system was breaking down. The traditional aristocratic consensus that had governed Rome for centuries was dissolving into factional warfare. Reformers and conservatives clashed with increasing violence. Tribunes were murdered in the streets. Constitutional norms were violated with impunity. Even more concerning for Rome's military credibility was the social war of 91 to 88 BC, a massive rebellion by Rome's Italian allies, who were demanding full Roman citizenship. The war was brutal and destructive, fought on Italian soil, consuming resources and attention that should have been directed outward. Mithridates watched and waited. He saw Rome distracted by internal conflicts, its armies committed to fighting other Italians, its leadership divided and dysfunctional. He saw an opportunity that might never come again. In 89 BC, while Rome was still fighting the social war, Mithridates made his move. He invaded Bithynia and Cappadocia, expelling their Roman-backed kings. When the Roman governor of Asia, Gaius Cassius, demanded that he withdraw, Mithridates refused. When Roman and allied forces marched against him, he destroyed them. The Battle of the River Amnias was a catastrophe for Rome. The Bithynian forces allied with Rome were annihilated. A Roman army under Manius Aquilius, one of the commissioners who had been sent to oppose Mithridates, was routed. Aquilius himself was captured and subjected to a gruesome execution. Molten gold was poured down his throat, a symbolic commentary on Roman greed. With no significant Roman forces remaining to oppose him, Mithridates swept through Asia Minor like a wildfire. City after city fell to him, some conquered, many surrendering voluntarily. The Greek populations, after decades of Roman exploitation, often welcomed him as a liberator. He presented himself as a champion of Hellenic freedom, come to break the chains that Rome had placed on the Greek world. Within months, nearly all of Rome's Asian territories were in his hands, and then he ordered the massacre. The Asian Vespers, the coordinated slaughter of Italian and Roman residents throughout Asia Minor, was planned with chilling precision. Mithridates sent secret instructions to the cities under his control. On a specific day, the same day, everywhere every Roman and Italian in Asia was to be killed. Citizens and freedmen, merchants and slaves, women and children, no exceptions. No sanctuary was to be respected. Anyone who sheltered Italians would share their fate. Anyone who killed them would receive a portion of the victim's property as a reward. The massacre was designed to achieve multiple objectives. First, it was meant to eliminate a potential fifth column. The Italians in Asia were loyal to Rome and represented a threat to Mithridates' control. By killing them, he removed any possibility of internal resistance or intelligence gathering on Rome's behalf. Second, it was meant to implicate the Greek cities in his rebellion. By making the local populations participants in the slaughter, Mithridates ensured that they could never reconcile with Rome. They had blood on their hands. They had no choice but to fight alongside Mithridates or face Roman vengeance. Third, it was meant to send a message. Rome was not invincible. Rome could be defied. Rome could be made to bleed. And fourth, perhaps most pragmatically, it was meant to erase debts. Many of the murdered Italians were money lenders whose records of loans owed by Greeks were destroyed along with their owners. The massacre was also a debt jubilee, freeing the Greek cities from financial obligations they resented. The killing was enthusiastic and thorough. In Ephesus, victims who fled to the Temple of Artemis, one of the most sacred sanctuaries in the ancient world, were dragged from the altar and slaughtered. In Pergamon, similar scenes played out at the Temple of Asclepius. In Traios, a local citizen named Theophilus was hired to carry out the executions, apparently because the Greeks themselves lacked the stomach for the actual killing, though not for the orders. Modern historians debate the number of victims. 80,000 is the figure given by ancient sources, and while it may be an exaggeration, there's no doubt that the massacre was massive. It represented the largest single act of violence against Roman citizens in the history of the Republic. When news reached Rome, it caused a sensation. The social war was just ending. The Roman people were exhausted, traumatized, and now faced with evidence that their empire was collapsing. The Senate declared war on Mithridates and authorized an expedition to reconquer Asia and punish the murder of Roman citizens. But who would lead it? The question of command became entangled in the vicious political conflicts that were consuming Rome. Two men wanted the job: Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Marius was the great popular hero, 7-time consul, savior of Rome from the Cimbri and Teutones, champion of the common people. He was also old, erratic, and increasingly paranoid, but he desperately wanted one more command, one more chance at military glory. Sulla was the rising star of the aristocratic faction, brilliant, ruthless, and utterly contemptuous of his rivals. He had served under Marius in Africa and claimed credit for capturing Jugurtha. He had distinguished himself in the social war, and he had been elected consul for 88 BC, which meant that the Mithridatic command was his by right. The Senate assigned the command to Sulla, but then a tribune named Publius Sulpicius Rufus, allied with Marius, pushed through legislation in the popular assembly transferring the command to Marius instead. Sulla was at Nola preparing his army for the expedition when he received news of the transfer. He faced a choice: accept the decision and surrender the command, or fight. He chose to fight. For the first time in Roman history, a general marched his legions against Rome itself. Sulla's soldiers loyal to him personally, not to the Republic, followed him without hesitation. They swept aside the hastily organized resistance and occupied the city. Marius fled for his life. Sulpicius was killed. The legislation transferring the command was annulled. Sulla departed for the east, leaving Rome in the hands of his allies. But he had set a precedent that would echo through the next 50 years of Roman history. He had shown that the army could be used to settle political disputes, that constitutional norms meant nothing when a general had loyal legions at his back. The Republic was dying, but it still had to deal with Mithridates. Sulla landed in Greece in 87 BC with approximately 30,000 men. Mithridates had not been idle during the Roman political crisis. He had dispatched armies to Greece, hoping to rally the Greek states to his cause and bring the war to Rome's doorstep. Athens had revolted against Roman control and welcomed a Pontic garrison. Much of mainland Greece was wavering. Sulla's campaign was methodical and brutal. He laid siege to Athens, eventually storming the city and subjecting it to a terrible sack. Ancient sources describe streets flowing with blood, killings so extensive that the dead couldn't be counted. When a delegation of Athenians tried to negotiate surrender by invoking their city's glorious past, Theseus and Themistocles and the heroes of Marathon, Sulla cut them off with contempt. "I was sent here to punish rebels," he said, "not to take lessons in ancient history." Athens fell in March of 86 BC. The Pontic forces in Greece retreated northward, pursued by Sulla. The decisive battle came at Chaeronea, a site famous as the location where Philip II of Macedon had crushed Greek resistance over to centuries earlier. Mithridates' general, Archelaus, commanded a large army. Ancient sources give wildly varying numbers, but it was certainly larger than Sulla's force, including scythed chariots and heavy infantry. Sulla won a crushing victory. Roman discipline and tactical flexibility overwhelmed the Pontic forces. Archelaus' army was destroyed. A second battle at Orchomenos confirmed Roman dominance. By the end of 86 BC, Greece was securely in Roman hands, and Mithridates' dream of bringing the war to the western Mediterranean had been shattered. But the war was far from over. Mithridates still held Asia Minor, and Sulla was about to receive very unwelcome news from Rome. While Sulla was fighting Mithridates in Greece, Rome itself had descended into chaos. The moment Sulla departed for the east, his political enemies moved against him. The consul Lucius Cornelius Cinna, man Sulla had foolishly trusted to maintain order, broke his promises and began overturning Sulla's arrangements. When resistance arose, Cinna was expelled from Rome, but Cinna didn't accept defeat. He raised an army from the Italian towns that had recently been granted citizenship, and he sent a message to the one man who hated Sulla even more than he did. Gaius Marius was in Africa, hiding from Sulla's death squads, a broken fugitive at 70 years old. When Cinna's invitation arrived, he saw one last chance at vengeance. He gathered a force of freed slaves and desperate men, sailed to Italy, and joined Cinna's march on Rome. The city fell without a significant fight, and then the killing began. Marius and Cinna unleashed a reign of terror that shocked even the violence-hardened Romans. Sulla's supporters were hunted through the streets and murdered. Prominent senators were cut down in the forum. Heads were displayed on the rostra, the speaker's platform, as trophies. The blood vendetta that had been building for years exploded into open slaughter. Marius himself seems to have lost his mind. Ancient sources describe him as barely coherent, consumed by rage and paranoia, pointing at enemies real and imagined, and watching as his soldiers dragged them away to die. When he died of natural causes in January of 86 BC, just 17 days into an unprecedented 7th consulship, many Romans breathed a secret sigh of relief. But Cinna remained in power, and he was determined to stop Sulla from returning. Sulla received news of these developments while besieging Athens. He now faced an impossible situation. Behind him in the east was Mithridates, still holding Asia Minor with substantial forces. Ahead of him in the west was a hostile government that had declared him a public enemy, confiscated his property, and would certainly kill him if he returned without an army. Most commanders would have been paralyzed by this dilemma. Sulla saw an opportunity. He needed to end the Mithridatic War quickly, not completely, not perfectly, but quickly enough that he could return to Rome and deal with his enemies before they grew too strong. That meant negotiating with the man who had murdered 80,000 Roman citizens. By 85 BC, Mithridates was ready to talk. The war in Greece had been a disaster. His armies had been destroyed. His Greek allies were losing faith. Roman forces under Lucius Valerius Flaccus, sent by the Cinnan government in Rome to replace Sulla, were advancing into Asia Minor, threatening to squeeze Mithridates between two enemies. Actually, Flaccus himself was no longer a problem. His own lieutenant, Gaius Flavius Fimbria, had murdered him and taken command of the army. Fimbria proved to be an aggressive commander, defeating Mithridates' forces in several engagements and even nearly capturing the king himself. But Fimbria was loyal to the Cinnan government, which meant he was Sulla's enemy as much as Mithridates was. The situation had become absurdly complex. Two Roman armies were operating in Asia Minor, technically on the same side against Mithridates, but actually hostile to each other. Sulla resolved the mess with characteristic ruthlessness. First, he negotiated directly with Mithridates. The two men met at the town of Dardanus in 85 BC, and Sulla offered surprisingly lenient terms. Mithridates would withdraw from all the territories he had conquered. He would surrender his fleet and pay an indemnity. He would return to the borders of his original kingdom. But there would be no punishment for the Asian Vespers, no trial, no vengeance. Mithridates would remain king of Pontus, free to rebuild his power. The Roman soldiers were outraged. They had fought and died to defeat a man who had massacred their countrymen, and now Sulla was letting him go with a slap on the wrist. When Sulla addressed the army to explain his decision, he acknowledged their anger, but insisted that practical necessity required a quick peace. He had other wars to fight. Then Sulla turned to deal with Fimbria. He marched his army to confront the rival Roman force, but there was no battle. Fimbria's soldiers had no desire to fight fellow Romans, especially Romans led by a commander with Sulla's reputation. They began deserting in droves. Within days, Fimbria found himself abandoned by his own men. He took refuge in a temple at Pergamon, where he eventually committed suicide. Sulla reorganized the combined forces, imposed a massive financial penalty on the Asian cities that had supported Mithridates, and prepared to return to Italy. The First Mithridatic War was over. Mithridates had lost everything he had gained, but he was still alive, still king, and already planning his next move. Sulla's return to Italy in 83 BC triggered the bloodiest civil war Rome had yet experienced. For 2 years, Sulla's forces fought against the Marian Cinnan government and its supporters. Battles raged across Italy. Entire cities were destroyed. When Sulla finally emerged victorious, he instituted the infamous proscriptions, published lists of enemies whose property was confiscated and whose lives were forfeit. Anyone could kill a prescribed man and claim a reward. Anyone who sheltered one risked death themselves. Thousands died. The Roman aristocracy was decimated. Political opposition to Sulla was effectively exterminated. Sulla made himself dictator a constitutional office, but one that had been dormant for over a century, and set about restructuring the Roman government. He strengthened the Senate, weakened the tribunes, and attempted to create safeguards against the kind of military adventurism that he himself had pioneered. When he was finished, he did something that shocked everyone. He resigned. In 79 BC, Sulla voluntarily gave up absolute power and retired to his country estate, where he devoted himself to drinking, writing his memoirs, and entertaining actors and musicians. He died in 78 BC, probably of liver failure, brought on by years of heavy drinking. His funeral was the most elaborate Rome had ever seen. His epitaph, which he reportedly wrote himself, read, "No friend ever served me, and no enemy ever wronged me, whom I have not repaid in full." It was an accurate summary of a terrifying life. But while Sulla had been fighting his civil war, Mithridates had not been idle. The ink on the Treaty of Dardanus was barely dry when the Romans began violating its spirit. Lucius Licinius Murena, who had been left in command of Roman forces in Asia Minor after Sulla's departure, was an ambitious man who wanted military glory. In 83 BC, he began probing Mithridates' borders, looking for an excuse to restart the war. Mithridates protested. He sent ambassadors to Rome, pointing out that he had kept the terms of the treaty, that the Romans were the aggressors. But Murena ignored him. He launched raids into Pontic territory, claiming falsely that Mithridates was preparing for war. What followed is known as the Second Mithridatic War, though war is perhaps too dignified a term. It was more of a border skirmish that got out of hand. Mithridates initially tried to avoid open conflict, but Murena kept pushing. Finally, in 80 BC, Mithridates counterattacked. His forces destroyed Murena's army in a decisive engagement, driving the Romans out of his territory. Sulla, dealing with his civil war in Italy, had no resources to spare for another eastern conflict. He sent envoys to both sides, ordering them to stop fighting. Mithridates accepted eagerly. Murena, humiliated by his defeat, had no choice but to comply. The Second Mithridatic War ended as quickly as it had begun, with Mithridates vindicated and Roman prestige damaged. It was a useful reminder that the Poison King was still dangerous and that Rome's internal problems were making it vulnerable. For the next decade, an uneasy peace prevailed. Mithridates rebuilt his army, strengthened his alliances, and prepared for the confrontation he knew was coming. Rome, exhausted by civil war and distracted by other problems, slave revolts, pirate raids, wars in Spain, paid little attention to the East, but everyone knew the peace was temporary. The fundamental conflict between Roman expansion and Mithridates' ambitions had not been resolved. Sooner or later, the war would resume. The spark came in 75 BC, and it came from an unexpected direction. Nicomedes IV, the king of Bithynia, Roman client, whose father Mithridates had expelled years earlier, died without legitimate heirs. On his deathbed, he bequeathed his kingdom to Rome. This was a common practice in the Hellenistic world. Client kings who lacked successors, or who feared their kingdoms would dissolve into civil war, often willed their territories to Rome in exchange for protection of their families and associates. Rome had acquired Pergamon the same way decades earlier, but the bequest of Bithynia was strategically momentous. Bithynia bordered Pontus directly. If Rome accepted the inheritance, Roman territory would extend right up to Mithridates' frontier. Roman governors, Roman tax collectors, Roman soldiers would be stationed on his doorstep. Mithridates understood what this meant. He had spent years rebuilding his strength, forging alliances, preparing for exactly this moment. The addition of Bithynia to the Roman Empire was the final provocation. In 73 BC, Mithridates launched a preemptive invasion. His armies swept into Bithynia, overwhelming the Roman garrison. At the same time, his fleet rebuilt since its surrender after the First War took control of the Aegean Sea, threatening Roman supply lines and communications. The Third Mithridatic War had begun. Rome's response was complicated by the usual political infighting. The consul assigned to the Eastern Command was Lucius Licinius Lucullus, no relation to the earlier Murena, despite the similar name. Lucullus was an unusual figure in Roman politics, an intellectual and aesthete who was also a gifted military commander. He had served under Sulla during the First Mithridatic War and knew the Eastern theater well. But he also had enemies in Rome who would undermine him at every turn. Lucullus arrived in Asia Minor in 74 BC and immediately demonstrated his capabilities. Mithridates had besieged the city of Cyzicus, a loyal Roman ally on the southern shore of the Sea of Marmara. The siege was enormous. Ancient sources claim Mithridates had 300,000 troops, though this is certainly exaggerated and Cyzicus seemed doomed. Lucullus didn't try to relieve the city directly. Instead, he maneuvered his smaller army to cut Mithridates' supply lines, slowly strangling the besieging force. As winter set in, the Pontic army began to starve. Disease spread through the camps, morale collapsed. By spring of 73 BC, Mithridates was forced to abandon the siege and retreat. His army, weakened by hunger and illness, was harassed by Roman cavalry throughout its withdrawal. Thousands died in the retreat. The great host that had invaded Bithynia was destroyed without a single pitched battle. It was a masterpiece of strategic warfare, and it established Lucullus as one of the great commanders of the age. Over the next several years, Lucullus systematically dismantled Mithridates' empire. He invaded Pontus itself, something no Roman commander had successfully done before. He defeated Mithridates in battle after battle, driving the king from his homeland. He captured the major Pontic cities, seized the royal treasury, and forced Mithridates to flee eastward into the kingdom of Armenia, where his son-in-law Tigranes the Great offered him refuge. Tigranes' involvement expanded the war dramatically. Armenia was a vast kingdom far larger than Pontus, stretching from the Caucasus Mountains to the borders of Parthia. Tigranes had built it into a major power, styling himself king of kings in the Persian manner. Lucullus demanded that Tigranes surrender Mithridates. Tigranes refused, dismissing the Roman ambassador with contempt. So Lucullus invaded Armenia. It was an audacious move, perhaps too audacious. Lucullus had only about 16,000 men. Tigranes, according to ancient sources, had over 100,000. The disparity was so great that when Tigranes first saw the Roman army, he reportedly laughed and said, "If they come as ambassadors, they are too many. If they come as soldiers, they are too few." He stopped laughing at the Battle of Tigranocerta in 69 BC. Lucullus attacked before Tigranes could properly deploy his enormous army. Roman legionaries crashed into the Armenian cavalry while it was still forming up. The elite cataphracts heavily armored horsemen who were supposed to be the decisive arm broke and fled without engaging. Their panicked horses trampled the Armenian infantry behind them. The result was a slaughter. Ancient sources claim that over 100,000 Armenians died at Tigranocerta compared to just a handful of Romans. These numbers are certainly exaggerated, but there's no question that the battle was a catastrophic defeat for Tigranes. Lucullus captured and sacked Tigranocerta, the Armenian capital that Tigranes had built as a monument to his own glory. The treasures he captured were legendary gold, silver, precious gems, exotic luxuries from across Asia. Mithridates and Tigranes fled deeper into Armenia, and Lucullus pursued them. The war seemed to be approaching its final act. Surely, after such crushing defeats, the Eastern kings would have to surrender. But Lucullus was about to discover that winning battles wasn't the same as winning wars. The problem was his own soldiers. Lucullus was a demanding commander. He enforced strict discipline. He restricted looting, wanting to preserve the wealth of conquered territories rather than letting his men plunder at will. He pushed his army relentlessly, marching through difficult terrain and harsh weather, always pursuing the retreating enemy. The soldiers hated him for it. Roman legionaries of this period expected war to be profitable. They wanted booty gold, slaves, valuables they could take home to Italy. Lucullus's tight control of plundering deprived them of what they considered their rightful rewards. Moreover, many of Lucullus's troops were veterans of the old Fimbrian army, the same soldiers who had once served under the man who murdered his commanding officer. They had been in the East for over a decade, far from home, and they were tired. They wanted to go home, not march endlessly through the mountains of Armenia. In 68 BC, as Lucullus pushed deeper into Armenia, pursuing Mithridates and Tigranes, his army began to fall apart. First came passive resistance soldiers refusing to march, breaking formation, ignoring orders. Then came open mutiny. Entire units refused to advance. Centurions who tried to enforce discipline were threatened by their own men. Lucullus was forced to turn back. The campaign that had been on the verge of total victory collapsed into an ignominious retreat. And Mithridates, the poison king who had seemed finished, came roaring back. While Lucullus was struggling with his mutinous army, Mithridates returned to Pontus. The Roman garrisons left behind were weak, their best troops having followed Lucullus into Armenia. Mithridates rallied his remaining supporters, raised a new army, and attacked. The results were devastating for Rome. At the Battle of Zela in 67 BC, Mithridates destroyed a Roman army under Gaius Valerius Triarius, killing over 7,000 legionaries. It was the worst Roman defeat since the opening of the war, and it came just when victory had seemed assured. Mithridates recovered much of Pontus. Tigranes, encouraged by the Roman setbacks, went back on the offensive in Armenia. Everything Lucullus had accomplished was crumbling. In Rome, Lucullus's enemies pounced. They accused him of prolonging the war for personal glory, of enriching himself at the expense of his soldiers, of failing to finish a conflict that should have been won years ago. They stripped him of his command piece by piece, first transferring his veteran legions to other commanders, then replacing him entirely. Lucullus returned to Rome bitter and humiliated. He would spend his remaining years in fabulous luxury. His gardens and dinner parties became legendary, but his career was over. He had come closer than anyone to destroying Mithridates, and he had been brought down not by the enemy, but by politics and mutiny. The war was now in its 20th year, and Rome needed a new commander. They turned to the one man who seemed capable of finishing anything, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. Pompey was the golden boy of Roman politics, handsome, charismatic, and victorious in everything he attempted. He had made his reputation during Sulla's civil war, winning battles in Sicily, Africa, and Spain while still in his 20s. He had suppressed the slave revolt of Spartacus, stealing credit from Crassus, who had done most of the work. He had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in a lightning campaign that took just 3 months. He was, in 66 BC, the most popular and most successful Roman alive. The tribune Gaius Manilius proposed giving Pompey command of the Mithridatic War with unprecedented powers. He would have authority over all Roman forces in the East. He could make war and peace as he saw fit. He would control the resources of multiple provinces. It was an extraordinary concentration of power, the kind of thing that would have terrified earlier generations of Romans. But the people were tired of the endless Eastern wars, and they trusted Pompey to end them. The law passed overwhelmingly. Pompey sailed east to take command. Mithridates, who had been fighting Rome for over 20 years, now faced his most dangerous opponent yet. Pompey arrived in the east with overwhelming force and a mandate to finish the war by any means necessary. Unlike Lucullus, who had fought with limited resources and faced constant political interference from Rome, Pompey had everything he needed. Multiple legions, a powerful fleet, the authority to make treaties and dispose of kingdoms as he saw fit. And most importantly, he had the political support to see the campaign through to completion. Mithridates understood immediately that the dynamics had changed. Against Lucullus, he had exploited Roman internal conflicts, the mutinous soldiers, the political enemies in Rome, the divided command structure. Against Pompey, these advantages disappeared. Pompey's army was loyal, his authority unchallenged, his resources seemingly unlimited. The Poison King tried diplomacy first. He sent ambassadors to Pompey, offering to submit to Rome, to pay tribute, to become a client king like so many others who had accepted Roman dominance. It was a remarkable climb down for a man who had spent decades defying Roman power. Pompey refused. His terms were simple, unconditional surrender. Mithridates must give up his kingdom, disband his army, and present himself in person to accept whatever judgment Rome chose to impose. For Mithridates, this was unacceptable. He had seen how Rome treated defeated kings paraded in triumphs, humiliated before the mob, executed in prison like common criminals. He had ordered the deaths of 80,000 Romans. There would be no mercy for him, so he prepared for one last fight. The campaign of 66 BC was a catastrophe for Mithridates. Pompey advanced into Pontus with methodical efficiency, avoiding the mistakes that had plagued earlier commanders. He didn't overextend his supply lines. He didn't push his troops beyond their limits. He simply applied overwhelming pressure, forcing Mithridates to retreat deeper and deeper into his shrinking kingdom. The decisive engagement came at night, near the Lycus River in the heart of Pontus. Mithridates had chosen his position carefully, a strong defensive location that he hoped would neutralize Roman advantages. But Pompey attacked before dawn, using the light of the full moon to guide his assault. The Roman legions crashed into the Pontic camp while Mithridates' soldiers were still half asleep. The battle was short and brutal. The Pontic army, caught off guard and unable to form proper battle lines, collapsed almost immediately. Roman cavalry swept around the flanks, cutting down fugitives. By sunrise, Mithridates' last major army had ceased to exist. The king himself barely escaped. He fled eastward with a small bodyguard, abandoning his kingdom, his treasury, and any hope of conventional military victory. Pompey pursued relentlessly. He drove Mithridates out of Pontus entirely, then turned to deal with Tigranes of Armenia, who quickly realized that continued resistance was futile. Tigranes surrendered, accepted harsh but survivable terms, and was allowed to remain king of a diminished Armenia as a Roman client. Mithridates had no such option. He fled north, through the Caucasus Mountains, toward the distant shores of the Black Sea. The flight through the Caucasus was a nightmare. Mithridates was over 60 years old now, exhausted by decades of war, accompanied only by a few thousand loyal followers, soldiers, family members, and retainers who had nowhere else to go. They marched through some of the most inhospitable terrain in the ancient world. Towering mountains, frozen passes, hostile tribes who saw the desperate refugees as targets for plunder. Ancient sources describe the journey in harrowing terms. Soldiers died of cold and exhaustion. Supplies ran out. The column was attacked repeatedly by mountain peoples who had no love for the Pontic king. Mithridates himself fell ill, possibly poisoned by one of his own entourage, though his famous immunity apparently saved him. But he survived. He emerged from the Caucasus and made his way to the Crimean Peninsula, where his son Machares ruled as a Pontic client king. Machares had a problem. He had made peace with Rome during his father's absence, accepting Roman suzerainty in exchange for being left alone. Now his father, Rome's greatest enemy, had appeared on his doorstep, expecting shelter and support. Machares tried to reconcile with Mithridates. He failed. Perhaps he attempted to betray his father to the Romans, or perhaps Mithridates simply didn't trust him after his accommodation with Rome. Whatever the reason, Machares ended up dead. Some sources say he killed himself to escape his father's vengeance, others that he was executed on Mithridates' orders. Either way, Mithridates was now master of the Crimean Bosporus, the Greek kingdom on the northern shores of the Black Sea that had been part of his empire for decades. He had lost everything else. Pontus was in Roman hands. His treasuries were captured. His armies were destroyed. His allies had abandoned him or been conquered. Any other man would have accepted defeat. Mithridates was not any other man. From his refuge in the Crimea, Mithridates conceived a plan so audacious that it bordered on madness. He would raise a new army from the peoples of the northern Black Sea Scythians, Sarmatians, the various tribes that inhabited the vast steppes beyond the limits of the Mediterranean world. He would lead this horde westward, following the Danube River into the heart of Europe. He would cross the Alps as Hannibal had done over a century earlier and descend into Italy itself. He would bring the war to Rome. It was a fantasy, of course. The logistics were impossible. The distances were immense. The tribes he hoped to recruit had no particular reason to follow an aging king on a suicidal march against the world's greatest military power. But Mithridates began gathering forces anyway. He conscripted soldiers from the Greek cities of the Crimea. He sent ambassadors to the Scythian chiefs. He accumulated supplies, weapons, ships. He acted as if the plan might actually work. His subjects were less enthusiastic. The Greeks of the Crimea had prospered under Mithridates' rule, but they had no desire to participate in a doomed expedition against Rome. They were merchants and farmers, not warriors. They had survived by staying out of great power conflicts, not by marching into them. When Mithridates began imposing heavy taxes and conscription to support his planned invasion, resistance grew. The conscripted soldiers were sullen and unreliable. The cities grumbled about the financial burdens. The sense that Mithridates was leading them to destruction spread through the population. And at the center of the growing discontent was the king's own son. Pharnaces had watched his father's decline with calculating eyes. He was Mithridates' eldest surviving son, the obvious heir to whatever remained of the Pontic kingdom. He had served loyally throughout the wars, commanding troops, administering territories, doing what was asked of him. But Pharnaces was not his father. He didn't share Mithridates' obsessive hatred of Rome or his willingness to sacrifice everything for the chance of victory. Pharnaces was a pragmatist. He could see that his father's Italian scheme was insane, that it would lead only to the complete destruction of the family and the kingdom. Moreover, Pharnaces had his own ambitions. If Mithridates died fighting Rome, the dynasty would die with him. But if Pharnaces could negotiate with the Romans, offer them his father's head in exchange for recognition as king of whatever territories remained, he might salvage something from the wreckage. In 63 BC, Pharnaces made his move. The details are murky, but the outline is clear. Pharnaces cultivated support among the disaffected soldiers and citizens of the Crimean kingdom. He reached out to Roman agents, signaling his willingness to betray his father. And when the moment was right, he raised the standard of rebellion. The defection spread like wildfire. Soldiers who had been conscripted against their will joined Pharnaces. Cities that resented Mithridates' demands opened their gates to the rebels. Within days, the king who had defied Rome for a quarter century found himself abandoned by almost everyone. Mithridates retreated to his citadel in Panticapaeum, the capital of the Crimean kingdom, with only a handful of loyal followers. Below him, his son's forces surrounded the fortress. Above him, there was nowhere left to run. The Poison King was finally cornered. In his final hours, Mithridates showed the same defiant spirit that had characterized his entire life. According to ancient sources, he gathered his remaining daughters to young women who had stayed loyal when everyone else fled and offered them poison. He would not let them be captured by the Romans, to be paraded in a triumph and subjected to whatever humiliations the victors chose to inflict. Better a clean death by their father's hand. The daughters drank the poison and died quickly. Then Mithridates raised the cup to his own lips. And here the story reaches its darkest irony. For decades, Mithridates had been consuming small doses of poison, building up his immunity, protecting himself against the assassination attempts that had plagued him since childhood. The Mithridates, his legendary universal antidote, had been refined over years of experimentation. Now, when he finally wanted to die, his body refused to cooperate. He drank the poison. Nothing happened. He waited for death to come, for the familiar symptoms that he had learned to resist. Still nothing. His carefully cultivated immunity, the very thing that had kept him alive through decades of plots and assassination attempts, now prevented him from ending his own life. Ancient sources describe Mithridates pacing the citadel in frustration, waiting for the poison to take effect, realizing with growing horror that it never would. Finally, he turned to Mithridates, a Celtic bodyguard who had remained loyal to the end. "You have served me faithfully," Mithridates said, or words to that effect. "Now grant me one last service. I have protected myself too well against poison, and the enemy is at the gates. Do what the poison cannot." Mithridates drew his sword and killed his king. Mithridates VI of Pontus, the poison king who had massacred 80,000 Romans, who had fought 3 wars against the greatest power in the ancient world, who had survived betrayal, defeat, and exile, died by the blade of his own loyal servant because his famous immunity to poison had become a curse. He was approximately 72 years old. He had been at war with Rome for most of his adult life. Pharnacus sent his father's body to Pompey as proof of the death and a gesture of submission. Pompey received the corpse and, in a gesture that surprised many, ordered it treated with respect. Mithridates was given a royal burial, his body interred in the traditional tombs of the Pontic kings. Pompey reportedly said that enmity should not extend beyond death, and that Mithridates had been a worthy opponent. It was a gracious gesture, and perhaps a calculated one. Pompey was building his image as a magnanimous conqueror, a man who could be trusted to rule the East with justice as well as strength. Treating his fallen enemy with dignity served that purpose. Pharnacus was rewarded for his betrayal. He was recognized as king of the Bosporan kingdom, the Crimean territories that had formed the last remnant of his father's empire. He would rule there for nearly 2 decades, a loyal Roman client, until Julius Caesar's famous victory against him at the Battle of Zela in 47 BC prompted the conqueror's famous dispatch, "Veni, Vidi, Vici." I came, I saw, I conquered, but that was far in the future. In 63 BC, the Mithridatic Wars were finally over. Pompey spent the following years reorganizing the entire eastern Mediterranean, creating new provinces, establishing client kingdoms, and building the political and administrative structures that would govern the region for centuries. When he finally returned to Rome in 60 BC, his triumph was the most spectacular the city had ever seen. The procession took to full days. It displayed the treasures of a dozen conquered kingdoms, the chains of captured kings and generals, the evidence of victories that had added vast territories to Roman control. Among the displays was information about Mithridates' crimes, his defeats, his final death. The man who had been Rome's most persistent enemy for a generation was now reduced to a prop in a victor's parade. So, what do we make of Mithridates and his wars? He was, without question, one of the most remarkable figures of the ancient world. He ruled for over 50 years, longer than almost any other Hellenistic king. He fought 3 major wars against the greatest military power of his age, losing each one but surviving to fight again. He demonstrated talents that would have made him formidable in any era: military skill, political cunning, personal courage, and an absolutely relentless will to resist. He was also a mass murderer. The Asian Vespers, the coordinated slaughter of 80,000 civilians, was one of the largest massacres in ancient history. It was premeditated, systematic, and designed to implicate entire populations in shared guilt. The fact that the victims were Roman and Italian doesn't make them any less dead. Mithridates justified the massacre as an act of liberation, a blow against Roman oppression. And there was truth in his propaganda. The Roman administration of Asia Minor had been exploitative and corrupt. The Italian businessmen who were killed had grown rich by impoverishing the Greek population. There were genuine grievances behind the violence, but explaining is not excusing. The massacre targeted not just the moneylenders and tax farmers, but their families, their wives, their children, their slaves. It targeted people whose only crime was being Italian in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was collective punishment taken to its most extreme conclusion. Mithridates paid for that crime with everything he had. 3 wars, each more desperate than the last. The destruction of his kingdom, the betrayal of his own son. A death that even poison couldn't provide. Was the price sufficient? That's not a question history can answer. The Mithridatic Wars had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate conflict. Most obviously, they completed Roman domination of the eastern Mediterranean. Before Mithridates, Rome's presence in Asia Minor was limited and contested. After him, Rome ruled from the Danube to the Euphrates, from the Black Sea to the borders of Egypt. The geopolitical transformation was enormous. The wars also accelerated the collapse of the Roman Republic. The commands given to Sulla, Lucullus, and Pompey were unprecedented concentrations of power. They normalized the idea that individual generals could be granted extraordinary authority over vast territories and multiple legions. They created the template that Caesar would follow when he conquered Gaul, and that Augustus would perfect when he established the empire. The wealth that flowed into Rome from the eastern conquests distorted Roman politics and society. Sulla used his plunder to fund his civil war and proscriptions. Pompey's eastern settlements made him the richest man in Rome. The influx of slaves, treasure, and luxury goods transformed the Roman economy and culture. The civil wars that would destroy the Republic, Marius versus Sulla, Pompey versus Caesar, the final confrontation between Octavian and Antony were all connected to the struggles over eastern commands and eastern wealth that had begun with Mithridates. In a sense, Mithridates' prophecy came true, though not in the way he intended. He had called Rome a city for sale and doomed to perish. If only it finds a bier. Rome didn't perish, but the Republic did. And the forces that destroyed it were unleashed, in part by the wars Mithridates had provoked. There's one more dimension to Mithridates' legacy worth considering. He became a symbol of resistance to empire, a figure who represented defiance against overwhelming power. For centuries after his death, his story was told and retold, often with sympathy for the rebel rather than the conqueror. The Enlightenment rediscovered Mithridates as a romantic figure. Racine wrote a famous tragedy about him. Mozart composed an opera. Poets and philosophers used his story to explore themes of tyranny and freedom, of noble resistance and inevitable defeat. Even his poison experiments captured the imagination. The concept of Mithridatism, building immunity through gradual exposure to toxins, entered the medical vocabulary and remained there for centuries. His legendary antidote, the Mithridatium, was still being prescribed by European physicians in the Renaissance, nearly 2,000 years after his death. There's something compelling about his story. The childhood spent fleeing assassins, the years of wilderness survival, the rise to power through ruthless determination, the decades of war against an enemy that should have crushed him immediately, the final betrayal, the failed suicide, the death by a loyal servant's sword. It's a tragedy in the classical sense, a great man destroyed by forces beyond his control, but also by his own flaws and choices. The massacre that made him Rome's eternal enemy. The paranoia that led him to kill family members and allies. The obsessive resistance that consumed his kingdom and his life. Mithridates couldn't stop fighting. Even at the end, trapped in his citadel with his son's army at the gates, he was still planning his march on Rome. The dream of final victory was more important to him than survival, than his family, than any rational calculation of costs and benefits. Was this courage or madness? Probably both. Great resistance and great destruction often come from the same source: an unwillingness to accept limits, to compromise, to bend. Mithridates bent for no one. And in the end, he broke. Memory of defiance.